Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
There's an election happening right now in New Brunswick. At issue are many things that you would expect. The economy and affordability, housing, immigration, the stuff you see on every voter's list. But there's another policy at stake here. And it has a number, 713. For a year now, New Brunswick has been the center of a debate that began in the United States but has now spiraled across Canada. Should schools be required to inform parents when a student chooses to identify by another name and gender? It began with Policy 713, which at the time, nobody at all considered worth much of a fuss. It was a simple update to previous policy that was based on current research, and it was in line with most other such policies across the country. But then some angry parents, perhaps misinformed by American talking heads, perhaps sincerely concerned about their relationship with their children, started making phone calls. And now, a year later, here we are. This is the story of Policy 713 and what's at stake. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Simon Lucen is a Toronto-based journalist who wrote about Policy 713 in New Brunswick and its impact across the country for Maclean's. Hi, Simon.
Hi there, Jordan.
Why don't you start with telling us a little bit about a family that's living at the center of this story, I guess. Who are the Rouses and what was their experience with their child?
So Sean and Amanda Rouse are a couple in New Brunswick living in a suburb outside of St. John. And when they find out they're pregnant with their third child, they have a really familiar problem that so many people can relate to, which is the problem of picking a name. All the consensus names, they use those up on their first two children and they can't agree on anything. And they're just going through option after option after option. And they think they arrive at an option that works. And then they realize that that option is actually, they have doubts about it and they have cold feet. And then they're back to the naming book again. And it just takes forever for them to arrive at a name. But finally, they pick a consensus name for the daughter that they're expecting. It's a tough battle to find that name. And they have no idea that, in fact, their child is going to have thoughts of their own on that name choice. Before their child turns 10, puberty hits, and puberty hits really hard. Their child has this deep discomfort with changes in their body, and particularly, they're very, very, very aware about clothing, and they're wearing clothing that hides every possible curve. And both Sean and Amanda Rouse are very aware of their child's acute discomfort. It's unlike anything they've seen with their other two older kids. And when their child comes out as first non-binary and then as trans, they are surprised because this is something they never thought they'd have to contend with. It's not something they were really thinking about. They're also relieved because they could tell that something was up. And now at least they know what's going on. Mm-hmm. When their child is 12, their child comes home with a test for the parents to sign, a test that the child did at school. And the name at the top of the test is a name they don't recognize, Levi Rouse. And so Sean, the dad, says to his child, who's Levi? And Levi says, that's my name now. That's the name I go by at school. And that is, as you can imagine, pretty destabilizing for the Rouses. It would be destabilizing for any parents because they worked so hard to find a name, and the name they chose had just been summarily cast aside for a name that they didn't even think of. What's more, Levi had been going by this name for months at school. He'd been identifying as Levi without telling his parents. So there was a degree of what looked like secrecy as well. But in time, they get used to the change. They notice that whenever they call Levi by his old name, he winces notably. He's deeply, deeply uncomfortable being referred to by his old name. And they come to like the name. And they start to realize that, in fact, their child wasn't being secretive, not in their opinion. What he was doing is he was figuring himself out. It's true that he didn't tell them right away when he changed his name, but they start to realize that he needed that space. Sean Rouse comes to the conclusion that, when you tell your parents about a big change, like a name change, that really makes it official. And so Levi needed to test drive that name change by identifying as Levi at school. And that's what he had to do before coming out to his parents. As they start to sort of respect that decision. They start to feel less betrayed and more understanding. And they come to this opinion that children need a space of privacy around themselves, a space to figure themselves out. And it's understandable that Levi's teachers at school gave him that zone of privacy to figure out his new name. And they also come to the realization that that zone of privacy is disappearing in New Brunswick due to a sudden policy change that takes them completely by surprise.
Tell me about the policy that's at the heart of allowing Levi privacy while he figured himself out, and what has happened to it.
So this is the heart of the piece right here. And it's a piece of HR policy. It's called Policy 713. It's a piece of HR policy from the Ministry of Education of New Brunswick. I never thought I would be writing a magazine article about a piece of HR policy from Canada's 8th largest province. But here we are. This policy has become an absolute firestorm, and it is at the center of a raging controversy across the country. The original version of the policy, it lands on the desk of Dominic Carty, who is the Minister of Education in New Brunswick. New Brunswick, in 2018, elected a progressive conservative minority government under Premier Blaine Higgs, and Dominic Carty is Higgs's Minister of Education. So he's in charge of educational policy. But this policy 713 has actually been developed over the last decade. So it's basically a lot of the work on developing the policy has already been done. It hasn't been ratified, but it's been developed, and it lands on Dominic Carty's desk. And it deals with gender and sexuality in the classroom. And really what it aims to do is to bring New Brunswick in line with a lot of norms on gender and sexuality in the classroom. It says that wherever possible, new bathrooms should be gender neutral and they should have individual stalls. On the issue of trans youth and school sports, should a trans girl be allowed to play on a girls' sports team? The policy basically says, well, this actually isn't our decision to make. The New Brunswick Interscholastic Athletics Association, it's their decision, so we'll defer to them. And then there's the issue of names and pronouns. What happens if a young person changes their name or changes their pronoun? Should teachers have to notify the parents? And what the policy says is that teachers should just honor a student's chosen name and chosen pronoun and move on with their life and not make a big fuss out of it. And to Dominic Carty, the Minister of Education, this all seems eminently reasonable. He doesn't think that anything in this policy is particularly controversial. So he finalizes it and he sends it as a courtesy on to the Premier for review. And then he waits and he waits and he waits. And the Premier never gets back to him. And he keeps reminding the Premier and he never hears back. And then in 2020, the writ drop. Blaine Higgs, the Premier, calls a snap election. And Carty starts to get really anxious. He feels like he's worked hard on this policy. He doesn't think that the Conservatives are going to lose the election, but you never know. And if they do, all of the work is going to go to waste. So quietly signs the policy on his own and officializes it, and it becomes the official policy in New Brunswick. The election happens. Higgs ends up going from a minority to a majority government. Carty is reelected. And when the government returns, Higgs calls Carty into his office, Higgs being the Premier, and Higgs is furious at Carty. He believes that Carty has sneaked this policy through behind his back, and he believes this policy is at odds with parental rights. He's particularly concerned about the piece on names and pronouns. He thinks that what this policy effectively does is it's telling teachers to lie to parents. And so this is the debate here. On one end side of this debate, you have Dominic Carty and the people who shaped this policy, which says that students have a right to figure out what their names are and what their pronouns are, and teachers should respect those rights. And on the other is a belief aligned with Premier Blaine Higgs, which says that if teachers don't inform parents about a name change or a pronoun change, they are effectively keeping secrets from parents. They are conspiring with students to withhold critical information from parents. And this is deeply deceptive, and it's at odds with parental rights.
And this is where, I guess, this becomes a firestorm, not just in New Brunswick, but other places in Canada as well. So maybe just if you can explain, where is Policy 713 now? And while this debate was going on, what's happening in the country at large?
So the Higgs government is reelected. Higgs is obviously very upset about this policy, even though technically it's his own government who has ratified this policy. But he believes that his minister did it in a duplicitous manner. His minister denies this. Carty says absolutely not. There was nothing duplicitous about it. I sent it to you for review. I waited and waited and waited. And hey, you know what? At the end of the day, I signed it because you know what? That's my job. I'm the Minister of Education. I get to sign policies.
Right.
A couple of years later, a school in Moncton, L'École Sainte-Bernadette, brings in a drag queen to do drag queen reading time to students, and parents are furious. And they start sending emails to the Premier's office. They believe that drag queen reading time is dangerous. They are worried that children are effectively being, quote unquote, groomed by pedophiles. At this point, Carty has resigned from his job as Minister of Education over a bunch of other disagreements with the Premier. There's a new Minister of Education, a man by the name of Bill Hogan, and he is suddenly swamped with emails from angry parents about drag queen reading time. And so this puts the parental rights debate back onto the minister's desk and the Premier's desk. And so the minister makes the decision to revise the policy. And the particular bit that they want to revise is the bit around names and pronouns. So they declare that from now on, if a child changes their name or pronoun, teachers must notify the parents, but only if the change in name is related to a change in gender. So if a student named Ashley decides to go by Ash, no, teachers don't have to notify the parents. So it's announced unilaterally. And a lot of people feel in New Brunswick that this is actually violating young people's rights.
In the context of this fight, give us a sense of the climate around the world on this stuff, particularly in the United States and in other Canadian provinces.
This stuff has been simmering in the United States. There are, I think, 11 or 12 different states, most of them red states, Republican-run red states, that have passed similar policies requiring teachers to notify parents about a name or pronoun change. It hasn't happened in Canada up until this point. New Brunswick is actually the first. But once New Brunswick goes ahead and does this, other provinces start catching on, including Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan now has passed a similar policy requiring parental disclosure, and Alberta is very much in the process of passing a similar law, actually. And there's even been rustlings about similar moves in Ontario. The Premier of Ontario has expressed his own opinions. The teachers should be obliged to notify parents. The leader of the official opposition, Pierre Poilievre, has also expressed his opinion that teachers should be in the business of sharing this information with parents. So this has become something of a hot controversy in Canada, but it all began in New Brunswick.
Who makes up the groups that are pushing for quote unquote parental rights? Because in your story, you describe a pretty wide swath, I guess, of people.
That's right. It's really hard to make blanket statements about who parental rights activists are. And I think there's a stereotype among progressives that parental rights activists are all sort of raging bigots. And absolutely, there are people on the parental rights side who I think most of us would describe as being far right. But it's not just that. There are a lot of people who I would consider quite centrist. A lot of people who I think are just normal parents who are worried. Raising kids is a confounding experience at the best of times. Our culture is changing in all kinds of ways, particularly as it relates to sex and gender. And I think parents understandably find that destabilizing. Also, the range of issues that parental rights activists worry about is very, very broad. And I'll confess that some of the things that parental rights activists worry about are things that I worry about too. Parental rights activists are concerned that during the COVID lockdowns, students were kept out of school for too long. And, I agree with that. Parental rights activists are worried about cell phones in school and tech in school and the distracting effects that technology has on students. I worry about that too. Parental rights activists are worried that sort of classical education, the great books, Canadian history, the history of the prime ministers is being neglected in schools. And you know what? I worry about that too. So there's a very broad range of different things that parental rights activists are worried about. And not all of them, I think, are in any way far-right issues. One of the issues, though, that has been most galvanizing for parental rights activists is so-called gender ideology in the classroom. The idea that schools are, quote unquote, indoctrinating students in a radical idea of gender, a radical understanding of gender. And parental rights activists are worried about things like drag queen story time, where drag queens are brought into school to read to children. They're worried about sex ed lessons that touch on everything from polyamory to kink culture to queer sexuality to trans identity. And they're worried that teachers are conspiring with students to, quote unquote, indoctrinate them into a radical conception of gender and to hide information from parents when young people decide to change their names or pronouns. Teachers not only are encouraging them to do this, but are also hiding this information from parents. So these are the kinds of concerns that are very galvanizing to a very wide range of parental rights activists.
What do we know about the legitimacy of their core concerns and the impact that it can have on kids to essentially be legislated, I guess, to be outed by their school? It's one thing to talk about, sex education or books or whatever, but at the core of this is about gender non-conforming kids looking for a safe space, right?
That's right. That is the core of this. And at the core of this is also the question of how much should parents be able to know about their kids and what's going on with their kids? To what extent is it parents' business what their kids are doing? And I'll say this right off the bat. I think in the majority of cases, it's in a young person's interest to talk to their parents about their gender and sexuality. If a child believes that they're trans or queer or genderqueer, they should probably talk to their parents. And in the overwhelming majority of cases, I think parents are quite supportive. Nevertheless, there are cases, of course, in which parents are not supportive. There are cases in which coming out to your parents could raise the possibility of abuse or neglect. there are cases in which young people simply aren't sure about their gender or their sexuality, and they need a little bit of space to figure that out. So while I think in the majority of cases it is in a young person's interest to talk to their parents, I can see that there are also a minority of cases in which that is not the case. And even if you agree that it's in a young person's interest to talk to their parents, there's a difference between encouraging a young person to talk to their parents and mandating that they talk to their parents or disclosing to their parents without their consent. And this, I think, is the nub of the issue.
You mentioned earlier that the pushback to repealing Policy 713 and other similar policies hedges on what sort of rights do children have. Can you explain what kind of rights they're supposed to have and how this works here?
In Canada, we have universal human rights, and children, it turns out, are human just like the rest of us. So absolutely, young people do have rights. In fact, young people have the same rights that adults have. The difference, of course, is capacity. What young people don't always have is capacity to exercise those rights. And of course, that raises the question, well, when do young people get capacity? And the only reasonable answer is that it's a sliding scale. You get different capacities at different points in your life.
Right.
I have a toddler at home. I make most decisions for her. When it's time to go to daycare, I decide that it's time to go to daycare. But she does have some capacity over some decisions. If she doesn't want a certain kind of food, I'm not going to force it on her. I can try to encourage her to eat it. But ultimately, if she says no, I mean that it is ultimately her capacity to decide whether she's hungry or not. As she gets older, she will have more and more rights. She'll get to make more and more decisions. There was a really consequential Supreme Court case, AC versus Manitoba. It involves a 14-year-old girl, Jehovah's Witness. Parents are Jehovah's Witness as well. And the girl wants to reject a life-saving medical treatment.
Right.
And the court has to decide whether she has the right to make that determination. And the court actually says no. The court says she does not have the right to make that determination. She's too young. But they acknowledge that if she was a little bit older, she might actually be able to make that determination. They think, at age 14, you probably don't have the capacity to make life or death medical decisions. But by the time you're 16 or 17, you know what? You probably do. And so we can extrapolate a little bit from that. If a young person under Canadian law has the right to make a life or death medical decision at, say, age 16, it would follow from that they probably have the capacity to make a less consequential decision about their name or their pronoun at a somewhat younger age.
Right.
So this is what it comes down to. It comes down to capacity. At what point do you have the capacity to make certain choices for yourself? And once you have that capacity, you absolutely do have your rights.
Before we get to what happens next in the courts, you mentioned earlier that a lot of the opposition to policies like 713 comes from things like Drag Queen Story Hour. How much of a role does misinformation or disinformation play into how people feel about what, to your point earlier, when it was implemented, was a very simple and standard policy?
I think information and disinformation plays a role, but it's not the whole picture. I think there's a temptation sometimes when sort of progressive or liberal journalists write about parental rights to sort of act like this whole issue just breaks down into the sort of enlightened teachers who understand, who have cutting edge ideas about gender and sexuality. And on the other end of the spectrum, the, benighted parents who are misinformed about what's going on in schools. And that's why they've become parental rights activists. And I think that way of seeing things is a little bit simplistic. And I can get into why I think that's simplistic. So I don't think it's fair to blame everything on misinformation, although I do think there is a little bit of misinformation out there around what it means for a young person to change their pronoun or their name in school. That is not the same thing as a young person having gender reassignment surgery at school.
Right.
I think people hear about transitions and it sounds really extreme. It sounds like a child is going to school and having a medical procedure of some kind.
That is, in fact, what a U.S. presidential candidate is alleging right now.
It's indeed what a U.S. presidential candidate is alleging. That is not happening. Nobody is getting gender reassignment surgery in the supply closets at school. What we're talking about when we're talking about social transitions is we're talking about people going by a different name or going by a different pronoun. These are immensely reversible changes.
Right.
You can change your name back. You can change your pronoun back. And I think there's a bit of misinformation around that.
What happens to rights-based challenges of these mandatory disclosure policies? Where are they sitting right now? Where might they go? And will we ultimately have to let the courts decide this?
I think it is probably going to be decided in courts. Not entirely clear to me whether the courts are going to have the last word, because there is also the notwithstanding clause,
right,
which Premier Scott Moe of Saskatchewan has said he was going to use this notwithstanding clause to protect his parental rights legislation. The biggest immediate challenge that actually happens in New Brunswick involves the East Anglophone School District. So New Brunswick is divided into 7 school districts. And one of these school districts, East Anglophone, decides that they think the revised version to Policy 713 is basically illegal. Effectively, by telling them to snitch on young children, to disclose young children's pronouns or gender changes to parents, the policy is effectively telling them to do something that is against the Charter of Rights. They believe it violates young people's privacy rights because young people, once you change your name, your old name is your personal information, and disclosing that personal information to anybody against their wishes is not okay. So forcing a teacher to continue calling a young person by their former name because they haven't disclosed to the parents the name change would be a violation of the child's privacy rights because you would be effectively disclosing that name to the rest of the class. There's a sense also that you are overriding a young person's consent. A young person gets to decide who they tell about their sexual orientation. If a young person says they do not want their parents to be told, it is their right to consent to that or to withhold consent. And in telling the parents against the wishes of a child, you are overriding their consent. So those are the concerns that the East Anglophone School District has. And so it writes its own version of the policy. And the government unilaterally cancels that version. East Anglophone School District writes another version of the policy. Eventually, the whole thing ends up in court. And the courts decide that the East Anglophone School District doesn't have standing to challenge the government on this issue because they are not, according to the logic of the court, they are not a concerned party. They are a school district. They're not teachers. They're not students. Therefore, they don't have standing. What the court does not say, though, is that the East Anglophone School District is wrong in its understanding of the charter. So there are various other charter challenges happening. The ACLU is currently suing the government of New Brunswick over this, and an organization called Your Pride is currently suing the Saskatchewan government over its parental rights bill. And there are almost certainly going to be charter challenges to Alberta, too, over its parental rights bill as well. And the question is, what's going to happen? What are the courts going to decide? And what are governments going to do once courts decide? Are governments going to push on using the notwithstanding clause? Or are they going to defer to the court's understanding of the Constitution? My own personal opinion is I am very skeptical that these parental rights bills can survive a charter challenge. I think the charter is quite clear that children do have the same rights that adults have. It's quite clear about the fact that once a child gets capacity to exercise those rights cannot be taken away. I'm not really sure if there is a constitutional space for these rules around disclosing pronoun changes to parents.
So while we wait for the courts, there is one last bit of business, I guess, in New Brunswick. The premier who started all this is currently up for re-election, right? There's a campaign on right now. Is this seen as a parental rights referendum there? And what does the election look like? Do we know what his opponents would do on this policy were they elected?
So right now, the election in New Brunswick is a dead heat. The Liberals are leading slightly in the popular vote projections. The Conservatives are leading slightly in the seat projections, but who knows? Really impossible to say what's going to happen. I think it is pretty clear that if the Liberals win this election, they will go back. They will revert to the original version of Policy 713. And certainly the issue of Policy 713 is very much at play in this election. What I think is most interesting, though, is the way that this issue has transformed New Brunswick politics and transformed the Progressive Conservative Party itself. Because there were huge waves of dissent when the Progressive Conservative Party undid this policy, when they revised this policy and declared that actually, contrary to what they'd said earlier, teachers were going to be obliged to disclose to parents. There was huge dissent within the party itself. A bunch of cabinet ministers resigned. One cabinet minister actually resigned teary-eyed on the floor of the legislature. A lot of MPPs who have represented the government will not be standing for re-election. So at the same time that you have dissent within the party, you also have the arrival of a new kind of political coalition. People who sort of come out of the woodwork and start supporting the party over this issue. In my piece, I talk about a really interesting character, a woman by the name of Fétine Grisseshi. And Fétine represents, I think you would say, a sort of Christian conservative activist. She runs a talk show called Fétine TV. She's wonderfully charismatic. She's just sort of a beautiful speaker, a very compelling person. And also a person with very, very right-wing views, opposition to gay marriage, opposition to abortion, came up really during the gay marriage debates during the early Harper era as a real kind of powerful opponent of gay marriage. She moves to New Brunswick in 2020. She attempts to run, actually, in the 2020 election, but she loses the nomination, and she's considered too right-wing for the Progressive Conservative Party. But then we have the fallout over Policy 713. And we have these resignations from Higgs's cabinet, these people who think that the party has moved too far right on this issue, and they resign. And there's even talk of a leadership review. Riding associations across the province of New Brunswick start trying to enact a leadership review, basically to take down Blaine Higgs, the premier. And Fétine Grossechi starts a petition where people will sign on, ordinary New Brunswickers will sign on and pledge to support the premier in the event of a leadership review. And it gets tens of thousands of signatures, enough signatures that it becomes crystal clear that if this leadership review happens, Blaine Higgs will almost certainly survive. And he will survive because of this new groundswell of rank and file support. So what we see is a real shift in the political coalition. This formerly centrist party, the Progressive Conservatives, are really moving towards the right. And, what Fétine Grossechi's petition signals to the Conservatives is it's okay. You don't have to placate your centrist colleagues. You don't always have to play to the center. There are other sources of power here in Canada. And if your centrist colleagues are angry at you, you can find other kinds of voters who might even keep you alive. And I think that is the tactic that Blaine Higgs is using going into this election. It's going to be a close election, but he is by no means losing this election. He is running, though, as a very different kind of premier to the kind of person he was 4 years ago. And frankly, the Progressive Conservatives have become a somewhat different party. The base has shifted, in large part because of this issue.
That's quite a legacy for a simple policy that was sitting on a desk, standardized everywhere.
Isn't it wild? A relatively bland piece of HR policy from a small province in Canada. It's quite amazing how much of a firestorm this has kicked up.
Simon, thank you so much for this.
Thank you so much for having me.
Simon Lucen, writing for Maclean's. That was The Big Story. For more, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. And if you want to send us feedback, there's a Contact Us form there. There are also other ways to get in touch, and I'm sure that some of you have feedback about this episode. I would expect nothing less. The way to do that is by emailing hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or by picking up the phone and calling us, 416-935-5935. The Big Story is available on all your podcast players and on all your smart speakers. All you got to do is ask it to play The Big Story podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.